Hello, and welcome to Blessed Sleep, where faith meets rest through the timeless wisdom of Scripture. Tonight, we will share the journey of a weary shepherd named Asher, a narrative inspired by Psalm 62, the psalm of quiet trust and divine refuge. This story explores the transformative power of finding rest in God alone during life's most turbulent seasons. And it teaches us about the profound renewal that comes when we cease our striving and simply wait in silence before the Lord. As you listen, allow these faith-filled words to enfold you, bringing tranquility to your mind and renewal to your spirit. Let the gentle guidance of biblical wisdom lead you to a place of complete peace, resting in the presence of God. If this video blesses you, I would be deeply grateful if you could take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows me to continue sharing God's wisdom through these stories, creating more content designed to bring peace and spiritual refreshment through Scripture-inspired narratives. Now, take a deep breath, settle into God's presence, and let us begin tonight's journey through this blessed story. The sun had not yet broken over the eastern hills when Asher's eyes opened in the darkness of his small dwelling. The walls of packed earth and stone held the coolness of night, and somewhere outside he could hear the first tentative stirrings of his flock. 37 sheep. He counted them each evening before sleep took him. 37 lives dependent on his vigilance, his wisdom, his strength. The responsibility had once felt like a sacred trust, a calling inherited from his father Joachim and his father's father before him. But this morning, like so many mornings in recent weeks, the weight of it pressed against his chest like a stone too heavy to lift. He rose slowly, his joints protesting the movement. 42 years he had walked these hills, and every stone, every thorn bush, every hidden spring was written in his memory like the words of Torah his mother had taught him as a boy. Yet lately, the familiar paths seemed longer, the climbs steeper, the nights colder. It was not merely the body's weariness, though that was real enough. It was something deeper, a fatigue of the soul that no amount of sleep could remedy. Asher wrapped his woolen cloak around his shoulders, rough spun and patched in 3 places by his wife Miriam's careful hands. She still slept, her breathing soft and steady in the pre-dawn darkness, and he was grateful not to see the concern in her eyes that had grown more pronounced with each passing moon. She knew, as wives know, that something in her husband had shifted, some essential spring of vitality running dry. But what could he tell her? That he was afraid? That the strength he had always relied upon seemed to be ebbing away like water poured out on thirsty ground? He stepped into the courtyard of their small home on the outskirts of the village of Tekoa, a settlement perched on the edge of the Judean wilderness. The sky was beginning to pale in the east. That luminous gray that comes before color returns to the world. His sheep were already moving, sensing his presence, their soft bleating a sound as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. Each one he knew by sight and temperament. The bold ram who led, the nervous ewe who always lingered at the back, the spring lambs now half-grown, still learning the rhythms of the flock. As he led them out through the narrow gate, past the other humble dwellings of Tekoa, the village remained mostly silent. A few spirals of smoke rose from morning fires being kindled. Somewhere, a rooster proclaimed the coming day, its call echoing off the limestone cliffs that surrounded them on 3 sides. Tekoa was a shepherd's village, always had been, too far from the king's road to attract traders, too poor in soil for rich harvests, but blessed with endless miles of rough pasture where sheep could graze and a man could think. But Asher's thoughts this morning, as on so many recent mornings, were not peaceful ones. They circled like vultures over a carcass, picking at his fears, his failures, his growing sense of inadequacy. 3 weeks ago, he had lost a lamb to a jackal, his attention wandering at the crucial moment. 2 months before that, he had misjudged the coming of the rains and nearly lost half his flock to a flash flood in one of the wadis. Small failures, perhaps, the kind any shepherd might experience, but they had begun to accumulate in his mind like stones in a wall, building up evidence of his declining capacity. The path led eastward into the wilderness, where the land fell away in great terraced slopes toward the salt sea that lay invisible in the distant haze. Here the grass grew sparse and hardy, surviving on dew and the occasional winter rain, but his sheep knew how to find it, their mouths working steadily as they spread across the hillside. Asher found his customary spot, a flat-topped boulder worn smooth by centuries of wind, and settled himself to watch. This was when his father used to pray, in these quiet hours when the flock was content and the day's dangers still distant. Joachim would close his eyes and recite the psalms he had learned by heart, his lips moving silently, his weathered face peaceful in concentration. Asher could remember watching him as a boy, wondering at the serenity that seemed to emanate from his father in those moments, as if he were touching something invisible but utterly real. But when Asher tried to pray now, the words felt hollow in his mouth, rote recitations that bounced off the indifferent sky. Where was the peace his father had known? Where was the assurance that the Lord heard, that he cared, that he would provide? The silence that followed his prayers felt empty, a void that mocked his attempt at faith. The sun climbed higher, painting the wilderness in shades of amber and rust. Heat began to radiate from the stones. Asher's eyes scanned the flock automatically, counting, assessing, watching for any sign of trouble. The wilderness was beautiful in its harshness, but it was never safe. Lions still prowled the deeper wadis, though they were growing scarce. Wolves traveled in packs, especially in winter. Even the land itself was treacherous, full of hidden crevices where a sheep might fall and break a leg, or cisterns long abandoned that became death traps for the unwary. His mind drifted to the village elders who had spoken to him last week after the Sabbath assembly, not unkindly, but with the practical concern of men who understood that a shepherd's reliability affected the whole community. "Asher," old Benjamin had said, placing a gnarled hand on his shoulder, "we see that you carry a heavy burden. Perhaps it is time to consider taking on an apprentice, a young man who could share the labor." The suggestion, though gently made, had cut deeply. They saw his weakness. They were preparing for his failure. A raven croaked overhead, circling on black wings, and Asher watched it with dull eyes. Even the birds seemed to mock him, free and unburdened, while he remained chained to his responsibilities, to his diminishing strength, to his fear. What would become of Miriam if he could no longer provide? They had no children, a grief they had learned to carry in silence over the years. There would be no son to inherit his flock, no daughter whose husband might support them in their old age. There was only this, his sheep, his labor, his slowly failing body and spirit. The morning stretched on, minutes flowing into hours with the patience of sun on stone. Asher ate the bread and dried figs Miriam had wrapped for him, but they tasted like dust. He drank from his water skin, but it did not quench the deeper thirst. Around him, the wilderness shimmered in the heat, beautiful and terrible, ancient and indifferent. He felt suddenly very small, very alone. a speck of life in a vast expanse of stone and sky. It was past midday when he noticed one of his sheep, the old ewe he called Hava, had separated from the flock and was making her way toward a cluster of scrubby bushes in a small depression. He rose to follow her, his staff in hand, concerned she might have caught scent of water and be heading toward one of the dangerous cisterns. But when he reached the depression, he found instead a spring he had never seen before, a thin trickle of water seeping from between two rocks, forming a small pool no larger than a man's hand. Hava drank deeply, and Asher knelt beside her, cup in his hands to taste the water. It was cold, impossibly cold given the heat of the day, and sweet beyond measure. He drank again, and then again, feeling the water course through him, and for a moment, just a moment, the knot of anxiety in his chest seemed to loosen slightly. As he sat back on his heels, studying this unexpected gift, he noticed something carved into the rock face beside the spring. Hebrew letters, worn by weather, but still legible. "The Lord is my rock and my salvation." The words sent a shiver through him despite the heat. Who had carved them here? When? And why did they seem to speak directly to his condition, as if the ancient hand that shaped them had known somehow that a weary shepherd named Asher would one day kneel in this spot, desperate and afraid? He stayed there longer than he should have, staring at those words, feeling something shift inside him, subtle as the first movement of wind before a storm. The spring continued its patient work, drop by drop filling the small pool, which overflowed in a thin stream that disappeared into the thirsty earth. Constant, steady, unhurried. There was something in that constancy that spoke to him, though he could not yet name what it was. When he finally returned to his flock, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western hills. The sheep had grazed well and seemed content, ready to be led back toward the village. As they walked, Asher found himself thinking about the spring, about the carved words, about the unexpected sweetness of that water. A tiny seed of something, not quite hope, not yet, but perhaps the memory of what hope had once felt like, took root somewhere deep in his troubled heart. That evening, as Miriam served their simple meal of lentil stew and bread, she studied his face in the lamplight. "Something changed today," she said softly. It was not a question. Asher looked at his wife, at the concern and love written in every line of her face, and found he could speak of it. "I found a spring," he said, "one I had never seen before, though I have walked those hills for 40 years, and there were words carved beside it, words from the Psalms." He paused, stirring his stew without eating. I think perhaps the Lord is trying to tell me something, but I am too weary to hear it clearly." Miriam reached across the small table and took his hand. Her palm was rough from years of work, but her touch was gentle. "Then perhaps," she said, "it is time to stop trying so hard to hear, and simply to be still and listen." Her words echoed in his mind as he lay on his mat that night, staring up at the darkness. Be still. Listen. It sounded simple, but for a man accustomed to action, to providing, to solving problems through effort and vigilance, it felt almost impossible. Yet the memory of that spring, of its patient constancy, its quiet gift of life-giving water, would not leave him. Sleep, when it finally came, was troubled by dreams. He dreamed he was climbing an endless mountain, his flock scattered behind him, and no matter how hard he climbed, the summit remained impossibly distant. He woke in the deep hours of the night, his heart pounding, and lay listening to Miriam's breathing, to the distant sound of a desert wind moving through the village, to the profound silence beneath all sound. In that silence, unbidden, words came to his mind, not his own thoughts, but something else, something that felt like remembering and discovering at the same time. My soul finds rest in God alone. The words from Psalm 62, which he had learned as a boy and recited countless times without truly hearing them. But now, in the darkness, they took on weight and substance. Rest in God alone, not in his own strength, not in his own wisdom or vigilance or effort, in God alone. He rose before dawn again, moving quietly so as not to wake Miriam, and led his flock out into the wilderness. But this morning he turned his steps deliberately toward the place where he had found the spring. The sky was clear, scattered with stars that would fade as morning came, and the air was cool and still. His sheep followed trustingly, knowing he would lead them to water and pasture, knowing his voice, knowing his care. When he reached the depression where the spring flowed, Asher settled himself on the ground beside it and simply sat. He did not pray, not in the formal sense. He did not recite psalms or make requests or try to manufacture some feeling of connection with the divine. He simply sat, listening to the sound of water dripping into the pool, watching his sheep graze peacefully nearby, feeling the growing light of dawn begin to transform the landscape from shadow to substance. Minutes passed, then more minutes. His mind, accustomed to constant activity, raced through its catalog of worries and plans. But he let the thoughts come and go without grasping at them, as his father had once taught him. Like sheep, thoughts would wander, but they did not need to be chased. They would return to the shepherd when called. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift. The knot in his chest, which had become so familiar he barely noticed it anymore, began to loosen. Not dramatically, not with any great revelation or thunderclap of divine communication. Just a quiet easing, like the unclenching of a fist held tight too long. His breathing deepened. His shoulders, which he realized had been hunched with tension, relaxed downward. The spring continued its patient work, and he continued his patient sitting, and in that shared patience, something sacred occurred. He began to remember things, not the recent failures and fears that had dominated his thoughts, but older memories, better ones. His father teaching him to identify each plant of the wilderness, which were good for the sheep and which were poisonous. His mother singing psalms as she worked, her voice sweet and sure. The day he had first taken the flock out alone, barely 12 years old, and how his father had waited at the village gate for his return, pride shining in his eyes. The night Miriam had agreed to be his wife, her hand small and warm in his, the stars overhead seeming to multiply their light in celebration. He remembered a time when his strength had felt limitless, when each day was an adventure rather than a burden, when the future stretched before him full of possibility. What had changed? Not the land, which was as it had always been, not the sheep, who still needed the same care and guidance. What had changed was his trust. Somewhere along the way, perhaps so gradually he had not noticed it happening, he had stopped trusting in the Lord's provision and had begun to rely solely on his own resources. And those resources, being human and finite, were failing. The realization was both painful and liberating. Painful because it forced him to confront his own pride, the subtle arrogance of believing that everything depended on his effort alone. Liberating because it suggested a different possibility, that perhaps he was not meant to carry these burdens alone, that perhaps there was a strength beyond his own that he could draw upon. As the sun crested the hills and sent its first golden rays across the wilderness, Asher found himself speaking aloud, his voice rusty with disuse of this kind of honest prayer. "Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob," he said quietly, "I am afraid. I am weary. I do not know how to continue. But I am here, and I am listening. Show me what it means to find rest in you alone." There was no audible answer, no vision, no miraculous sign, just the continuing sound of the spring, the peaceful grazing of his sheep, the growing warmth of the sun on his face. But it was enough. For the first time in months, it felt like enough. He stayed at the spring longer than usual that morning, and when he finally returned to the village that evening, Miriam noticed the change immediately. Something in his eyes had cleared, like cloud cover parting to reveal sky. "You went back to the spring," she said, and he nodded. "I did, and I think—" He paused, searching for words. "I think I am beginning to learn something about rest, about trust, about not trying to carry everything alone." He looked at his wife, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in weeks. "I have been so focused on my weakness that I forgot about his strength." Miriam smiled, and her smile was like lamplight in darkness. "Then you are already wiser than you were yesterday," she said. That night, Asher slept deeply for the first time in months, and his dreams were peaceful. He dreamed of water flowing in the desert, of sheep safely gathered, of a shepherd's voice calling gently in the dusk, and he knew somehow that the voice was not his own, but one infinitely more sure, infinitely more kind. The next morning, and the morning after that, and for many mornings that followed, Asher returned to the spring before taking his flock to pasture. It became his ritual, his sacred time, his daily practice of what he was beginning to understand as waiting on the Lord. Each morning he would sit beside the water, sometimes for a few minutes, sometimes for an hour or more, simply being still and listening to the silence that was not empty but full of presence. He discovered that this silence had texture and depth. Sometimes it felt like comfort, a warm embrace that assured him he was not alone. Sometimes it felt like challenge, calling him to examine his heart for the hidden pride or fear that still lurked there. Sometimes it was simply peaceful, asking nothing, offering everything, inviting him to rest in the knowledge that he was held by something greater than himself. And gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, but with gathering momentum, things began to change. Not his circumstances. The hills were still steep, his body still aging, his responsibilities still weighty. But his experience of those circumstances transformed. Where before he had felt overwhelmed, now he felt held. Where before he had faced each day with dread, now he faced it with a quiet confidence that was not based on his own capacity, but on something far more reliable. His shepherding improved, not because he tried harder, but because he stopped trying so hard. He moved through his days with greater attention and less anxiety, noticing things he had been too preoccupied to see before. He found new springs, better pastures, safer paths. His sheep sensed the change in him and responded with trust, following more readily, straying less frequently. Even his body, though still aging, seemed to have more stamina, as if the easing of his inner tension had freed up energy previously spent on worry and fear. One morning, about a month after he had first found the spring, Asher arrived at his sacred spot to find someone else there. An old man sat beside the water, his beard white as the sun-bleached bones that sometimes littered the wilderness, his eyes closed in what appeared to be prayer or meditation. Asher hesitated, reluctant to intrude, but the old man opened his eyes and smiled. "Peace be with you, young shepherd," he said, his voice surprisingly strong despite his evident age. "Come, sit. This spring is gift enough for two. Asher settled himself on his usual rock, a bit uncertain how to proceed. He had grown accustomed to solitude in this place, to the privacy of his morning conversations with the divine. But there was something in the old man's presence that felt right, somehow, as if this meeting had been arranged. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then the old man spoke. "I carved those words," he said, gesturing to the ancient letters etched in stone. "Many years ago, when I was not much older than you are now, I was a shepherd too, you see. These hills were my home, this wilderness my temple." Asher looked at him with new interest. "You carved them? But they look so old." The old man chuckled, a sound like water over stones. "I am older than I look, perhaps, or perhaps the weather ages stone faster than we think. Either way, I carved them in a time of great distress when I thought I could not go on, when my strength had failed and my faith wavered. I had come to this spring seeking water for my flock, and I found more than water." "What did you find?" Asher asked, though he thought he might already know the answer. "Rest," the old man said simply. "True rest, not the rest of sleep, though that is good and necessary, but the rest of the soul that comes when we cease our striving and remember that the Lord is our rock, our fortress, our salvation, when we remember that it is not by our own might or power, but by His Spirit that we stand." He looked at Asher with eyes that seemed to see past surface and into soul. "You have been learning this, have you not? I can see it in the way you carry yourself. The burden has not disappeared, but you have learned where to lay it down." Asher nodded slowly. "I am still learning," he admitted. "Some days are easier than others. Some days I forget and try to carry everything myself again. But then I come here and I remember. I remember that my soul can find rest in God alone." "That is the work of a lifetime," the old man said gently. "This remembering and forgetting and remembering again. Do not be discouraged by the forgetting. It is part of the process. Each time you remember, each time you return to the place of rest, the lesson deepens. The roots go down further. Eventually, it becomes not just something you do, but something you are." They sat together as the sun climbed higher, two shepherds separated by decades, but united in their understanding of what mattered most. Eventually, the old man rose to leave, moving with surprising grace despite his years. He paused before departing and placed a hand on Asher's shoulder. "The spring will always be here," he said. "Even if one day you cannot come to this physical place, the truth it represents will remain. God is your rock, your salvation. In Him alone your soul finds rest. Let that truth be the spring you return to again and again all the days of your life." And then he was gone, making his way up the slope with steady steps, and Asher was left wondering if he had encountered an angel or simply a very wise old shepherd who understood the ways of God and the needs of weary souls. In the weeks that followed, Asher continued his morning practice, but now it felt different somehow, deeper and more established. The old man's words had given him permission to see his spiritual life not as something he needed to perfect, but as a practice he would return to over and over, each return strengthening the pattern, deepening the trust. He began to notice things in the scriptures he had recited since childhood, but never truly heard. One Sabbath, at the village assembly, when they recited Psalm 62, the words seemed to leap out at him with new force and clarity. "Truly my soul finds rest in God. My salvation comes from Him. Truly He is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will never be shaken." Never be shaken. not because he was strong, but because his foundation was unshakable, not because he had no weaknesses, but because his strength came from a source that never failed. The distinction was everything. He started to speak of what he was learning, carefully at first, to Miriam, then to a few trusted friends in the village. To his surprise, his words resonated with others who carried their own burdens of weariness and fear. Old Benjamin, who had suggested Asher take an apprentice, confided that he too struggled with the weight of responsibility in his role as elder. "I have served the community for 30 years, he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion, "and I am tired, so tired. But there is no one to replace me, and so I continue." Asher shared with him what he was learning about rest, about finding strength not in oneself, but in the Lord, about the daily practice of laying down burdens in the presence of God. Benjamin listened intently, his weathered face thoughtful, and when Asher finished, the old man's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I had forgotten," Benjamin said softly. "I had forgotten that it was ever possible to rest while still carrying responsibility. I thought rest was something that came only when all the work was done. But the work is never done, is it? So I have not rested in years." He gripped Asher's hand with surprising strength. "Tomorrow, will you take me to your spring? I think I need to learn what you have learned." And so Asher's mornings at the spring became sometimes solitary and sometimes shared. Benjamin came and brought his grown son who struggled with anxiety. Miriam came and found in the quiet her own deep well of peace. Even the young shepherd boy from the next village, barely 15, and already overwhelmed by the responsibility of his family's flock after his father's death, came and sat by the water and learned that his young shoulders did not have to carry the weight of the world alone. The spring became, without anyone officially declaring it so, a kind of sanctuary, not a formal place of worship, but something perhaps more fundamental, a place where people came to remember who they were and whose they were, a place where the constant striving could cease for a moment and the soul could breathe. Asher found that the more he shared what he was learning, the deeper his own understanding grew. Teaching others to find rest in God forced him to articulate truths he was still discovering, to put into words experiences that often felt beyond language. And in the articulation, the truths became more solid, more real, more accessible. One evening, as he and Miriam sat outside their home, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, she asked him a question that had clearly been forming in her mind for some time. "Do you think," she said slowly, "that the Lord allowed you to become so weary, so afraid, in order to teach you this lesson? Was it all purposeful?" Asher considered the question carefully. It was one he had asked himself many times. "I don't know if the Lord caused my weariness," he said finally, "or if it was simply the natural result of living in a fallen world, of aging, of carrying responsibilities with my own strength for too long. But I do know this. He used it. He used my weakness to teach me about His strength. He used my fear to teach me about His faithfulness. He used my exhaustion to teach me about His rest." He paused, looking up at the vast sweep of stars overhead. Perhaps that is what He does. He takes the difficult things, the broken things, the exhausting things, and He transforms them into opportunities for us to know Him more deeply, not because He delights in our suffering, but because He knows that we learn some truths only in the valley, only in the darkness, only when our own resources have completely failed. Miriam leaned against his shoulder, and they sat in companionable silence, two souls at rest in the presence of the one who held them. The night air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of wild thyme from the hills, and somewhere in the distance a night bird called, its voice clear and pure in the darkness. The seasons turned as seasons do. Winter came with its cold rains, transforming the wilderness into a temporary garden of wildflowers and green grass. Spring followed with its newborn lambs and the work of shearing. Summer brought heat and the challenge of finding sufficient water and shade. And through it all, Asher maintained his practice of morning visits to the spring, sometimes alone, sometimes with others, always seeking that place of rest that was not dependent on circumstances, but on something eternal and unchanging. He noticed that the quality of his life had changed in subtle but profound ways. He laughed more easily. He noticed beauty more readily, the way light fell on stone, the intricate pattern of a spider's web, the unexpected grace of a hawk in flight. His relationships deepened because he was present to people in a way he had not been before, no longer distracted by the constant noise of his own anxiety. Even his body, though it continued to age as bodies must, seemed healthier. The chronic ache in his back that had troubled him for years eased. He slept more soundly and woke more refreshed. It was as if the easing of his inner tension had allowed his physical form to relax and heal in ways it could not when he was constantly taut with stress. But perhaps the most significant change was in his relationship with God. What had once been formal and dutiful, the recitation of prayers learned by rote, the observance of laws and rituals, had become intimate and alive. He found himself talking to God throughout the day, not in formal prayer, but in the constant conversation of a child with a loving father. He shared his joys and his fears, his observations and his questions, and though there were no audible answers, he felt heard and understood in a way that satisfied something deep in his soul. One day, nearly a year after he had first found the spring, Asher was sitting in his usual spot when he noticed something remarkable. The thin trickle of water that had been flowing from between the rocks had increased, not dramatically, but noticeably. Where before it had formed a pool the size of a man's hand, now it had grown to the size of a basin. Where before it had disappeared into the ground after only a few feet, now it flowed for several yards before vanishing into the thirsty earth. He stared at it in wonder, trying to understand what had changed. Had there been more rain than usual? He didn't think so. Had something shifted in the rock, opening a larger channel for the water? Perhaps. Or was it something else, something he could not see or measure, some spiritual reality manifesting in physical form? As he pondered this mystery, words came to his mind, as they often did now in these quiet moments. Not his own thoughts exactly, but something given, something received. Those who trust in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. Renewed strength, not human strength which was finite and failing, but divine strength which was infinite and unfailing. Strength that came not from striving, but from resting, not from effort, but from trust, not from self-reliance, but from utter dependence on God. Asher understood in that moment that he was witnessing in the physical spring what had been happening in his own soul. The more he had learned to rest in God, the more strength had flowed through him. Not his own strength, but God's strength working in him and through him. And just as the spring gave water freely to all who came to drink, so the strength he received was not meant to be hoarded, but shared, poured out in service to others. He began to weep. quietly, tears of gratitude and awe running down his weather-beaten face. How patient God had been with him, how gentle in teaching him these lessons, how faithful in providing exactly what he needed, exactly when he needed it. The spring, the old man, the community that had formed around this place of rest, all of it was gift, all of it was grace, all of it was evidence of a love more constant than the rising sun. That evening, he shared with Miriam what he had seen and understood, and she listened with that deep attention that was one of her greatest gifts. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "when we were first married, I used to worry about you. You worked so hard, you carried so much, and I was afraid that one day you would simply collapse under the weight of it all. But then you found the spring, and you learned to rest, and now—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Now you carry just as much, maybe even more, but you carry it differently. It's as if you've learned the secret of letting God carry the weight while you simply hold the responsibility. Do you know what I mean?" Asher nodded slowly. Yes, he knew exactly what she meant. The burdens had not disappeared. His sheep still needed tending. The wilderness was still dangerous. His body was still aging. But none of it crushed him anymore because he had learned where to lay it down, how to let it rest in hands stronger and more capable than his own. The practice of resting in God became not just something Asher did at the spring, but something he carried with him throughout his days. When a difficult situation arose, he would pause, close his eyes briefly, and reconnect with that place of rest within himself where God's presence dwelt. When anxiety began to rise, he would breathe deeply and remember, "My soul finds rest in God alone. My salvation comes from Him." He taught this practice to others, not through formal instruction, but through example and gentle guidance. The young shepherd boy who had come to the spring struggling with anxiety learned to pause before making important decisions about his flock, to wait in stillness until he sensed the inner nudge of divine wisdom. Old Benjamin learned to begin his meetings as village elder with a moment of silent prayer, laying down the weight of leadership long enough to remember that he was not leading alone. The practice spread through the village like yeast through bread, quietly transforming the community from within. People began to move with less hurry, to speak with more kindness, to listen with greater attention. Disputes that might once have escalated were resolved peacefully, as individuals learned to step back from their reactive emotions and wait in the stillness for clarity to emerge. The village assemblies on Sabbath took on a new quality of reverence and peace, as if the very atmosphere had been sanctified by the collective practice of resting in God's presence. Asher observed these changes with quiet wonder. He had not set out to transform his community. He had simply been a weary shepherd seeking relief from his own exhaustion. But in finding rest for himself, he had inadvertently become a conduit for rest to flow to others. It reminded him of the spring. He had not created the water, had not caused it to flow. He had simply discovered it and made it accessible, and the water had done its own work of bringing life to all who came to drink. Years passed, as years do, marked by the unchanging rhythm of seasons and the gradual changes that come with age and experience. Asher's beard grew more gray than brown. His hands became more gnarled, marked by decades of gripping his shepherd staff and tending his flock. His sheep, of course, changed generation by generation, but the care they required remained constant, as did the landscape they grazed and the God who provided for them all. One spring morning, When Asher was well into his 50s, he arrived at the spring to find that it had grown substantially. What had once been a thin trickle was now a proper stream, flowing steadily from between the rocks and running for a considerable distance before disappearing underground. The pool had deepened and widened, now large enough that a man could kneel and submerge himself fully if he wished. Small fish had somehow found their way to this water, and grasses grew along its edges, creating a miniature oasis in the wilderness. Asher stood looking at it in wonder, remembering the first time he had knelt here, desperate and afraid, drinking from a trickle barely enough to wet his lips. Now the same source provided abundantly, generously, constantly. It was as if the spring itself had grown in response to what? To his faithfulness in returning? To the prayers of those who had come to drink? Or simply because that was the nature of living water, it grew, it spread, it multiplied, when given time and space. He thought of the words from the prophet Isaiah, words his mother had taught him long ago. The Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land and will strengthen your frame. You will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. At the time, he had thought these were merely beautiful metaphors, poetic language meant to inspire, but now he understood they were descriptions of reality, of how the spiritual life actually worked. When you learn to draw from the eternal source, when you learn to rest in God alone, you became yourself a spring, a channel through which living water could flow to others. The seasons continued their ancient dance. Summer yielded to autumn, autumn to winter, winter to spring. Each season brought its own challenges and gifts. In winter, when rains came and the wilderness bloomed briefly into a garden, Asher marveled at how the same harsh land that seemed so barren in summer held such potential for life. It only needed water. How like the human soul, he thought. We all carry within us the capacity for abundant life, for flourishing, for joy. We only need to be watered by the presence of God, to drink deeply from the source that never fails. One particular spring, when the wildflowers carpeted the hills in waves of red and yellow and purple, Asher received word that old Benjamin had fallen ill. The elder, who had been the first after Asher to discover the practice of resting in God, now lay on his mat, his breathing labored, his strength failing. Asher went to him immediately, finding Benjamin's family gathered in the small house, their faces etched with concern. Benjamin's eyes lit up when he saw Asher, and he gestured weakly for him to come close. "My friend," he whispered, his voice thin as paper, "I am glad you came. I wanted to thank you." "Thank me?" Asher knelt beside the mat, taking the old man's hand. "You have been like a father to me, Benjamin. If there is any thanks, it flows from me to you." Benjamin shook his head slightly. "You gave me something precious in my final years. You showed me how to rest, how to truly rest. I have not been afraid, Asher, not once, even as I feel my strength ebbing away, because I know where my soul finds its rest, in Him alone." Tears gathered in Asher's eyes. "You learned well, my friend, better than your teacher." "We taught each other," Benjamin said. His breathing was becoming more difficult, but his eyes remained clear and peaceful. That is how it should be. That is how the Lord works, through His people, teaching and learning, giving and receiving. He paused, gathering strength. "Promise me something." "Anything." Continue going to the spring. Continue teaching others. This practice, this gift of resting in God, it is too precious to let die. Promise me it will continue after I am gone." Asher gripped the old man's hand more tightly. I promise. On my life, I promise." Benjamin smiled then, a beautiful smile that seemed to light his face from within. "Good. Then I can rest easy." He closed his eyes, and his breathing, though still labored, seemed to settle into a peaceful rhythm. "Tell me about the spring, Asher. One more time. Tell me about the water." And so Asher spoke softly and steadily, describing the spring as it was now. The clear pool, the constant flow, the fish and grasses, the carved words still visible on the rock face. He spoke of how it had grown from a trickle to a stream, of how it had become a place of pilgrimage for many in the village and beyond. He spoke of the peace that descended when one sat beside it, of the clarity that came in the silence, of the renewal that flowed from simply being still and knowing that God was God. Benjamin listened with his eyes closed, a slight smile on his lips, and gradually his breathing eased and deepened. Whether he slept or had passed into that final rest, Asher could not immediately tell. But there was such peace on his face, such complete serenity, that Asher felt no alarm. He continued speaking softly, more prayer now than description, commending his friend's soul to the God they both had learned to rest in. Benjamin died 3 days later, surrounded by his family, his passing as peaceful as his final years had been. The village mourned him deeply, for he had been a wise and faithful elder. But there was also celebration in the mourning, for everyone could see that he had died well, had finished his race with grace and dignity and unshakable faith. At Benjamin's request, they buried him on a hillside overlooking the spring. It was not the traditional burial place, but the family agreed it was fitting. This was the place where Benjamin had learned to truly live, and so it was appropriate that it should mark his rest in death. Asher carved a simple marker using the same words that had been carved beside the spring. "The Lord is my rock and my salvation." In the months that followed Benjamin's death, Asher found himself thinking often about legacy, about what remained when a person's physical presence departed. Benjamin had left no great wealth, no monuments, no writings that would be studied by future generations. But he had left something more valuable. He had left peace in the hearts of those who knew him, wisdom passed down through patient teaching, an example of how to age with grace and face death with courage. And he had left Asher with a renewed sense of purpose. The promise he had made to Benjamin weighed on him, not as a burden, but as a calling. He began to be more intentional about inviting others to the spring, about sharing what he had learned, about passing on the practice of resting in God. He discovered that he had a gift for this kind of teaching, not through formal instruction, but through story and example, through patient presence and gentle guidance. Young men came to him, struggling with the anxieties of establishing households and providing for families. Women came, carrying the weight of loss or the fear of barrenness. Elderly people came, facing the diminishment of age and the approach of death. Children came, brought by parents who wanted them to learn early what Asher had learned late, that rest and strength come from God alone. To each person, Asher offered the same invitation. Come to the spring, sit beside the water, be still, listen. And in the listening, in the stillness, in the patient practice of returning again and again to that place of rest, transformation happened. Not dramatic, not instantaneous, but real and lasting and deep. One day, traveling rabbi came through Tekoa, a man of considerable learning who had studied in Jerusalem and knew the sacred texts with impressive depth. Word spread of his presence, and the village gathered to hear him teach. Asher attended, curious to hear what this learned man might say. The rabbi was indeed impressive, his knowledge vast, his interpretation subtle and sophisticated. But as Asher listened, he realized that for all the rabbi's learning, something was missing. The words were accurate, but not alive. The interpretations were clever, but not transformative. It was like looking at a map of the spring instead of drinking from it. After the teaching, the rabbi approached Asher. Word had reached him of the shepherd who had discovered a spring and turned it into a place of spiritual renewal. "I would like to see this spring," the rabbi said. "I have heard remarkable things about it." Asher led him to the spring the next morning, arriving as the sun was just cresting the eastern hills. The rabbi looked around, clearly expecting something more impressive. "This is it?" he asked, unable to hide his disappointment. "I had heard there was something special here." "There is," Asher said simply, "but you have to drink to discover it." The rabbi looked skeptical, but knelt and cupped his hands in the water. He drank, then waited, then drank again. After several minutes he stood, brushing off his robes. "It is sweet water, I grant you, but I fail to see what makes it worth all the attention it receives." Asher studied the man carefully. "Rabbi, may I ask you a question?" "Of course. You know the scriptures better than anyone in this region. You can recite entire books from memory. You understand the law and the prophets. But tell me, when was the last time you simply sat in God's presence without trying to understand or explain or interpret? When was the last time you let yourself be known by God instead of trying to know about God?" The rabbi stiffened, clearly offended. "I spend my entire life studying the sacred texts. What do you think that is if not seeking God?" "It might be," Asher said gently, "or it might be studying about God while never actually meeting Him. There is a difference, Rabbi. One fills the head with knowledge. The other fills the soul with peace." The rabbi's face flushed. "You, a simple shepherd, presume to lecture me about spiritual matters?" "I presume nothing," Asher replied, his voice still gentle. "I only share what I have learned. And what I have learned is this: all my knowledge, all my effort, all my striving meant nothing until I learned to be still and simply rest in God's presence. The spring is not special because of the water. It is special because of what happens when we stop long enough to drink." The rabbi stared at him for a long moment, anger and curiosity warring in his expression. Finally, the curiosity won. "Show me," he said abruptly. "Show me what you mean." And so, Asher taught the learned rabbi what he taught everyone: how to sit, how to breathe, how to release the constant mental activity, and simply be present. It was clearly difficult for the rabbi, whose mind was accustomed to constant engagement with texts and ideas. He fidgeted, his lips moved as if reciting silently. His eyes darted around, unable to settle. But Asher was patient as the spring itself, and gradually, over the course of several hours, something began to shift. The rabbi's breathing deepened, his shoulders relaxed, the tight lines around his mouth softened, and when he finally opened his eyes, there were tears streaming down his face. "I had forgotten," he whispered. "In all my studying, all my learning, I had forgotten what it feels like to simply be with Him, not analyzing, not interpreting, not trying to understand, just being." Asher nodded, saying nothing, letting the man have his moment of discovery. The rabbi stayed in Tekoa for 3 more days, spending most of his time at the spring. When he finally departed to continue his travels, he was a changed man. The intellectual arrogance had been tempered by humility, the academic knowledge enriched by experiential wisdom. He took with him not just information about the spring, but the practice itself, which he promised to share in every community he visited. Years continued to pass, each one adding its own chapter to Asher's story. He watched as the practice of resting in God spread far beyond Tekoa, carried by travelers and pilgrims who had visited the spring and then returned to their own villages with the gift they had received. He heard reports of other springs being designated as places of rest, other communities adopting the practice of regular contemplative silence before God. His own life continued its steady rhythm. The sheep still needed tending, the seasons still turned, his body continued its gradual aging, but none of it troubled him as it once had. He had learned the secret that had eluded him for so long, that strength comes not from striving, but from resting, not from self-reliance, but from utter dependence on God. Miriam aged alongside him, her hair turning silver, her hands growing more gnarled with arthritis. But her spirit remained strong, and the bond between them deepened with each passing year. They had learned to walk through life as partners, not just in labor, but in faith, encouraging each other in the practice of rest, reminding each other when old anxieties tried to creep back in, celebrating together the goodness of a God who provided constantly and faithfully. One evening, as they sat outside their home, watching another sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose, Miriam spoke thoughtfully. "Do you remember when you first found the spring? How desperate you were, how afraid." "I remember," Asher said. "It feels like another lifetime, like a different person." "In a way it was," Miriam said. "That man who set out into the wilderness that morning, carrying all his fears and trying to manage everything in his own strength, he died at that spring, and someone new was born." Asher considered this. Death and rebirth. Yes, that is what happened, though I did not understand it at the time. I had to die to my own efforts, my own wisdom, my own strength. I had to learn to rest in God alone, and in that rest I found life I had never known was possible. "And you have given that gift to so many others," Miriam added softly. "Benjamin, the young shepherd, the anxious mothers, even that proud rabbi. You have shown them the way to the spring." "God showed them," Asher corrected gently. "I was just a fellow traveler who had stumbled upon it first. That is all any of us can be. Signposts pointing toward the source, fellow pilgrims sharing what we have discovered on the path." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Somewhere a lamb bleated, calling for its mother. A night bird sang its evening song. The desert air grew cool and sweet, carrying the scent of sage and wild mint. The following Sabbath, at the village assembly, Asher was asked to share his thoughts on Psalm 62, the psalm that had become so central to his life and teaching. He stood before the gathered community, children sitting at the front, elderly leaning on walking sticks at the back, families pressed close together in the middle, and spoke from his heart. "Truly, my soul finds rest in God," he began, reciting the familiar words. "My salvation comes from him. Truly, he is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will never be shaken." He paused, looking around at the faces watching him, seeing in them the same struggles he had once carried. For many years, I recited these words without understanding them. They were beautiful poetry, comforting sounds, but I did not know what they meant. I did not know what it was to truly rest my soul in God. He told them about his journey, about the growing weariness and fear, about the day he had found the spring and the carved words. He spoke of the old man who had appeared beside the spring, teaching him about rest. He described the slow transformation the gradual learning, the constant practice of returning again and again to that place of stillness where God's presence could be felt and known. Rest is not laziness, he said. It is not the absence of work or responsibility. I still tend my sheep every day. I still face challenges and difficulties, but I face them differently now, because I have learned that my strength does not come from my own efforts, but from God. My security does not depend on my abilities, but on His faithfulness. My worth is not measured by what I accomplish, but by whose I am. He looked around the assembly, his voice growing softer but more intense. This is what the psalmist means when he says, "My soul finds rest in God alone." It is not one source among many. It is the only source that never fails, the only foundation that never shakes, the only well that never runs dry. Everything else, our strength, our wisdom, our resources, these are finite and failing, but God is infinite and faithful. An elderly woman in the back called out, her voice quavering but clear, "But how, Asher? How do we learn this rest? Some of us are too old to journey to the spring every day." Asher smiled. "The spring is a place, yes, but it is also a practice, a posture of the soul. You can rest in God wherever you are. When you wake in the morning, before you begin your tasks, take a few moments to be still and remember whose you are. When anxiety rises during the day, pause and breathe and reconnect with the source of your strength. When you lie down at night, let go of the day's burdens and rest in the knowledge that God holds you." A young man stood, his face troubled. "But what if we forget? What if we try this rest and find ourselves falling back into old patterns of anxiety and striving?" "You will forget," Asher said simply. "I still forget, even after all these years. This is not a lesson you learn once and master forever. It is a practice you return to daily, sometimes hourly. Each time you remember, each time you return to that place of rest, the pattern deepens. The path becomes more familiar. Eventually, it becomes not just something you do, but something you are." He recited the psalm again, slowly, letting each phrase sink in. As he spoke, he could see understanding dawning on some faces, questions forming on others, peace settling on still others. This was the work he had been called to, not to be a teacher in the formal sense, but a witness to what he had experienced, a guide pointing toward the spring that had saved his life and transformed his soul. When the Sabbath assembly ended, many people approached Asher with questions, with stories of their own struggles, with requests for guidance. He listened to each one with patience and attention, offering what wisdom he could, always directing them back to the fundamental practice: be still, rest in God, trust in His faithfulness. Among those who approached him was a young woman named Rebecca, recently widowed, her face drawn with grief. "I have lost everything," she said quietly. "My husband was everything to me, and now he is gone. How can I rest when my heart is breaking?" Asher took her hand gently. "The psalm does not promise that we will have no pain, no loss, no sorrow. It promises that in the midst of all these things, we can find rest in God. Your grief is real and valid. The loss you feel is profound. But even in this valley of shadow, God is with you. He is your rock, your salvation, your fortress." "I do not feel His presence," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I know," Asher said. "There are seasons when God seems distant, when the silence feels empty rather than full. But this is when faith matters most, when we cannot feel His presence, but choose to trust in His faithfulness anyway." Come to the spring, Rebecca. Come and sit beside the water. You do not have to pray eloquent prayers or manufacture feelings you do not have. Just sit, just be, and let the water remind you that God provides even in the desert, even in the darkness. She nodded, wiping her eyes, and Asher knew she would come. He had seen it many times before, the way grief and loss could break people open, making them receptive to truth they might have dismissed in easier times. It was a terrible grace, this suffering that drove people to seek God with desperate urgency. The spring continued to grow. By the time Asher reached his 60th year, it had become a significant stream, flowing year-round, sustaining vegetation and wildlife for a considerable area around it. The village elders formally designated it as a sacred site, building a small shelter nearby where pilgrims could rest, carving additional verses from the Psalms into the surrounding rocks. But Asher insisted that it remain accessible to all, that no fees be charged, no formal rituals required. "It is a gift," he said firmly, when some suggested establishing official guardians or charging for access. Like God's grace, it must remain free and available to anyone who thirsts. His reputation spread far beyond Tekoa. People traveled from distant villages, even from Jerusalem itself, to meet the shepherd who had discovered the spring and learned the secret of rest. Some came seeking miracles, expecting dramatic healing or supernatural signs. Asher always disappointed them. "There are no miracles here," he would say gently, or rather, the only miracle is the constant, patient work of God in a willing soul. That is miracle enough. To those who came seeking rest, however, he gave everything he had learned. He taught them the practice of stillness, the discipline of releasing anxious thoughts, the art of listening in silence. He taught them to recognize the difference between the noise of their own minds and the quiet voice of divine presence. He taught them that rest was not the absence of activity, but the presence of peace in the midst of activity. One year, during the Feast of Tabernacles, when many pilgrims passed through Tekoa on their way to Jerusalem, a group of Greek-speaking Jews from Alexandria arrived at the spring. They were philosophers and scholars well versed in both Torah and Greek wisdom, and they were curious about the practice that had gained such renown. Asher welcomed them, though he was initially intimidated by their learning and eloquence. They asked sophisticated questions about the nature of divine presence, the relationship between action and contemplation, the tension between human effort and divine grace. Asher answered as best he could, drawing not on formal education, but on lived experience. One of the Greeks, a man named Theodore, was particularly persistent. "But surely, you see," he argued, "that what you describe is essentially a form of stoic apatheia, the detachment from external circumstances that the philosophers have taught for centuries." Asher shook his head. "I do not know this word apatheia or the teachings of your philosophers, but what I have learned is not detachment. It is attachment, deep, profound attachment to God. I do not become indifferent to my circumstances. I become secure in them because I know who holds me." "But the effect is the same," Theodore pressed. "Peace in the midst of turmoil, equanimity in the face of difficulty." "The effect may appear similar," Asher acknowledged, "but the source is different, and the source matters. Your philosophers teach you to find peace within yourself, through your own wisdom and discipline. I am teaching the opposite, that we cannot find peace within ourselves, that we must look beyond ourselves to the God who made us. This is not self-mastery, but self-surrender." Theodore frowned, considering this. The other Greeks watched the exchange with interest. Finally, Theodore said, "Then show me, not with words which can be debated endlessly, but with the practice itself. Let me experience what you describe. And so Asher taught the Greek philosophers as he taught everyone else, through example and patient presence, through invitation rather than argument. He sat with them beside the spring hour after hour, day after day, simply being still, simply resting in God's presence. Some of the Greeks found it unbearable, their minds too active, their need for intellectual engagement too strong. They left after a day or two, dismissing the practice as simplistic. But Theodore stayed, and slowly, painfully, he learned to quiet his brilliant mind, to stop analyzing and simply experience. On the fourth day, as the sun rose over the wilderness, something broke open in him. Asher watched as the man's carefully constructed intellectual defenses crumbled, as tears streamed down his face, as he wept like a child. "All my life," Theodore said when he could finally speak, "I have been building arguments about God, constructing philosophical systems to explain the divine. But I have never just let Him hold me. I have never stopped trying to understand long enough to simply be known." Asher nodded, saying nothing, letting the moment speak for itself. When Theodore finally departed to continue his journey to Jerusalem, he was a changed man. The intellectual pride remained, but it was tempered now by humility. The philosophical sophistication remained, but it was grounded now in experience. He promised to write about what he had learned, to share with the Greek-speaking Jewish communities throughout the empire this practice of resting in God. "But do not make it complicated," Asher cautioned as they said farewell. "That is the temptation for learned men, to take something simple and make it complex. Rest is simple. A child can understand it. Do not obscure that simplicity with philosophy." Theodore smiled. "I will try, though simplicity does not come naturally to Greek minds. We prefer our truth wrapped in dialectics and syllogisms." "Then perhaps that is what you must surrender," Asher suggested gently. "Perhaps your brilliant mind is not the pathway to God, but the obstacle you must lay down in order to find Him." The Greek philosopher nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. Yes, I think you're right. Thank you, teacher." "I am not a teacher," Asher said, as he had said countless times before. "I am simply a shepherd who found a spring and learned to drink from it. Everything else flows from that." As the years accumulated, Asher began to feel the weight of age more significantly. His joints ached with the cold dampness of winter. His eyes grew weaker, making it harder to spot straying sheep in the dim light of dawn or dusk. His hearing dulled, so that he had to listen more carefully to catch the sounds that might signal danger to his flock. But his soul had never been stronger, never more at peace. The external diminishments that would have terrified the younger Asher barely troubled him now. He knew that his strength had never come from his physical capacity, that his worth had never been measured by what he could accomplish. He was held by something far stronger than his failing body, sustained by a source that never diminished. Miriam noticed the changes, of course, as wives always do. She began to take on more of the household tasks that had once been shared, to prepare his food with extra care, to make sure he rested adequately. Their conversations grew quieter, more contemplative, full of comfortable silences that spoke as eloquently as words. One evening, as they sat together watching the stars emerge, Miriam asked a question that had clearly been forming in her mind. "Are you afraid of what comes?" Asher knew immediately what she meant. The unspoken reality that hovered over every aging couple, that one day, perhaps soon, they would be parted by death. He considered the question carefully. "No," he said finally, "I am not afraid. Sad, yes, at the thought of leaving you or of being left. But afraid? No. I have learned that the God who has held me every day of my life will not suddenly abandon me in death. The rock that has been my foundation does not crumble at the boundary between life and whatever comes next. Miriam leaned against his shoulder. I am glad, she whispered, because I am not afraid either. Whatever comes, we will face it as we have faced everything else, resting in the knowledge that we are held. They sat in silence for a long time, two elderly people at peace with their mortality, secure in their understanding of what mattered most. The night air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of the wilderness. Somewhere in the darkness, a sheep called out, and Asher recognized the voice instantly. The nervous you who always worried, always looked for threats. After all these years, she still had not learned to rest. He smiled at the thought. Even sheep had their temperaments, their personalities, their struggles. As autumn turned to winter in Asher's 65th year, he decided it was time to train a successor. Not because he planned to stop shepherding, he would tend his flock until he physically could not, but because he wanted to ensure that someone would carry on both the practical work and the spiritual wisdom he had accumulated. He chose a young man named Daniel, barely 20 years old, eager and intelligent, but also humble enough to learn. Daniel had grown up in Tekoa, had visited the spring many times with his parents, and had absorbed the practice of resting in God from childhood. Now, Asher invited him to become his apprentice. I will teach you everything I know about shepherding, Asher told him on their first day working together, where the best pastures are, which plants are poisonous, how to treat common ailments in sheep, how to protect the flock from predators. But more importantly, I will teach you how to shepherd yourself, how to rest in God so that you can lead from a place of peace rather than anxiety. Daniel proved an apt student. He learned quickly, asked good questions, showed both courage and compassion in his care for the sheep. But more than that, he seemed to understand instinctively the deeper lessons Asher was trying to impart. When a lamb wandered off, Daniel did not panic, but calmly tracked it down. When a ewe rejected her newborn, Daniel patiently worked to reconcile them rather than giving up. When storms threatened, Daniel prepared carefully, but without frantic worry. You are teaching me what my father tried to teach me, Daniel said one day as they sat together watching the flock graze. But somehow, learning it in this context, learning it while also learning to shepherd, makes it more real. I understand now what it means to rest in God. It is not passive, it is active, but the action flows from peace rather than fear. Asher smiled, pleased. Yes, you understand, that is the paradox that confuses so many people. They think rest means doing nothing. But true rest, rest of the soul in God, actually enables us to work more effectively, more sustainably, because we are no longer working from a place of desperate striving, but from a place of secure trust. As winter deepened, Asher found himself spending more time at the spring, sometimes with Daniel, sometimes with others from the village, sometimes alone. The cold water flowed steadily, unfrozen, despite the chill in the air, sustained by some deep underground source that was not affected by surface conditions. It reminded him of what he had learned, that the spiritual life, when rooted deeply in God, remained constant regardless of external circumstances. One particularly cold morning, Asher arrived at the spring to find a family huddled nearby, a man, a woman, and 3 small children, their clothing travel-stained and inadequate for the weather. They were clearly refugees of some kind, fleeing from something or traveling toward some hoped-for destination. "Peace be with you," Asher called out in greeting. "You look cold and hungry. Come, let me share what I have." The man looked suspicious at first, as refugees often were, accustomed to hostility or exploitation. But something in Asher's face or voice seemed to reassure him. "We do not want to be a burden," he said carefully. "You are not a burden, but a blessing," Asher replied, echoing words he had heard the old man at the spring say years ago. "In serving you, I serve God." He shared his bread and dried fruit, showed them how to drink from the spring, helped them build a small fire to warm themselves. The children, initially frightened and shy, gradually relaxed, laughing as they watched the small fish in the pool. The parents told their story, fleeing from a village to the north where drought and failed crops had made life unsustainable, heading toward relatives in a southern city, hoping for a fresh start. "Rest here as long as you need," Asher told them. "This is a place of refuge, and when you are ready to continue your journey, may you carry with you the peace you find here." He taught them the practice of resting in God, simpler terms than he might use with someone more educated, but the essence was the same. Be still, trust, know that you are held. The family stayed for 3 days, regaining their strength, finding their hope renewed. When they finally departed, the father embraced Asher with tears in his eyes. "You have given us more than food and shelter," he said. "You have given us something to hold on to when everything else seems uncertain. This practice of resting in God, we will carry it with us. We will teach it to our children. We will never forget what we learned beside this spring." Asher watched them walk away, the small family growing smaller in the distance until they disappeared over a rise. He wondered how many others he had touched over the years, how many lives had been changed by what had begun as his own desperate search for relief from exhaustion and fear. It was humbling to think about, this ripple effect of grace spreading out from one small spring in the wilderness. Spring came again, bringing warmth and new life. Asher's 66th year had arrived, and he felt it in his bones. The morning climb to the spring took longer now, required more rest stops. His breathing grew labored more easily, but his spirit remained strong, perhaps stronger than ever, as if the weakening of his body had somehow strengthened his soul. Daniel had largely taken over the daily shepherding duties, though Asher still accompanied him most days, unable to give up entirely the work that had defined his life. They made a good team, the old shepherd and the young one, each learning from the other, each contributing what they could. One morning, as they led the flock toward the spring, Daniel asked a question that had clearly been weighing on his mind. "Teacher, what will happen to the spring when you are gone? Who will guide those who come seeking rest?" Asher smiled at being called teacher, though he had never claimed the title. "The spring does not depend on me, Daniel. It flowed before I found it, and it will flow after I am gone. As for those who come seeking rest, they will find what they seek, because what they truly seek is not me, but God. I am just a signpost pointing the way. When I am gone, you will be the signpost, and after you, someone else. The practice will continue, because it is not my practice, but God's invitation to all who are weary and burdened. But what if I am not wise enough, not experienced enough? You will be exactly as wise and experienced as you need to be," Asher assured him. "Remember, Daniel, I was not a wise teacher when I found this spring. I was a desperate, exhausted shepherd who had run out of his own resources. It was my weakness that prepared me to receive what God wanted to give. Your inadequacy is not a disqualification, but a qualification. Only those who know they need God can truly help others find Him. They reached the spring and settled into their customary practice, sitting in silence, releasing the anxious thoughts that wanted to crowd in, resting in the presence that was always there, always available, always faithful. The sheep grazed peacefully nearby. The sun climbed higher, warming the air, and in that ordinary moment, in that daily practice repeated for the thousandth time, there was extraordinary peace. As summer approached, bringing its intense heat and the challenge of finding adequate water and shade for the flock, Asher began to feel a growing sense of completion. He could not have said exactly what he meant by that, could not have explained the subtle shift in his inner landscape. But it was as if his life was rounding some final curve, approaching some destination he could not yet see but could somehow sense. He did not speak of this feeling to Miriam or Daniel or anyone else. There seemed no need. It was not a premonition of death exactly, though perhaps that was part of it. It was more a sense that his work was done, that the task he had been given was approaching completion, and that whatever came next would be right and good and in God's hands. He continued his daily rhythms with renewed appreciation for their beauty. Each morning at the spring became not just practice, but celebration. Each evening with Miriam became not just companionship, but communion. Each day with the flock became not just duty, but worship. He was learning, in these final seasons of his life, that all of life could be prayer when lived from a place of rest in God. One particularly warm afternoon, as he sat watching his sheep graze on a hillside dotted with late summer wildflowers, Asher noticed a young couple approaching. They were clearly pilgrims, their clothing travel-worn, their faces marked by the particular exhaustion that comes from carrying burdens too heavy for young shoulders. The woman was pregnant, her condition advanced, and the man supported her carefully as they climbed the slope. "Peace be with you," Asher called out in greeting. "Come, rest in the shade. You look weary." The couple accepted gratefully, settling themselves against a large rock where they could catch the slight breeze. Asher offered them water and dried figs, watching as color slowly returned to the woman's pale cheeks. "We heard about the spring," the young man said after they had drunk and rested. "We have come from 2 days' journey north. They say a shepherd here has found a place where God's presence dwells, where the weary can find rest." Asher smiled gently. "I am that shepherd, though I am no one special, just a man who stumbled upon a gift and learned slowly what to do with it. Tell me, what burdens bring you seeking rest?" The young man looked at his wife, and she nodded permission for him to speak. "We married against our family's wishes," he said quietly. "We are from different clans, and our union has brought difficulty. We have been cast out, both of us, and now, with the child coming, we are afraid. We have no home, no support, nowhere to turn. We are trying to reach her uncle in Hebron, hoping he might take us in, but we do not know if he will." His wife added, her voice soft but steady, "We have only each other, and we have God, or at least we are trying to believe we have God. But sometimes the fear is so great that we forget how to trust." Asher looked at them with deep compassion, seeing in their faces the reflection of his own younger self, the man who had carried fear like a physical weight. "Come," he said, rising slowly, "let me take you to the spring. Your sheep will be fine here. My flock will keep them company." He led them down the slope to the depression where the spring flowed. It was late afternoon, and the angle of the sun painted the rocks in shades of amber and gold. The water sparkled as it flowed, and the pool had grown deep enough that small fish darted in its shadows. The couple stood looking at it and Asher could see disappointment beginning to cloud their faces. "Is this all?" the young man asked, trying to hide his feelings but not quite succeeding. "We expected something more." "Sit," Asher said simply, "and I will tell you what I have learned." They settled themselves by the water, and Asher sat across from them, his old body finding its familiar position with the ease of long practice. He was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts, and then he began to speak. "When I first found this spring, I was like you, afraid, exhausted, carrying more than I could bear. I came here seeking relief, seeking answers, seeking some sign that God still cared about a worn-out shepherd who had lost his confidence and his peace. And what I found was not what I expected." He gestured to the spring. "I found water, simple, clear, cold water flowing from stone. Nothing miraculous in appearance, nothing that would draw crowds or inspire songs. Just water, doing what water does, flowing, sustaining, giving life. And beside it, words carved by someone I would later meet, words from the Psalms. 'The Lord is my rock and my salvation.'" The young woman was listening intently, her hand resting on her swollen belly. Asher continued, his voice taking on the gentle rhythm of a storyteller who has told this tale many times but never without reverence. "I drank from this water, and it was sweet. But the real gift was not the water. It was what the water taught me. I learned that God provides constantly, quietly, without fanfare or drama. This spring flows whether anyone watches or not, whether anyone drinks or not. It simply flows because that is its nature. And I learned that God's provision is like that, constant, reliable, given freely to all who come to drink." He paused, letting his words settle. "But I also learned something deeper. I learned that I could not manufacture peace through my own effort, could not force rest through techniques or disciplines, could not earn God's presence through religious performance. I could only receive. I could only open myself like dry ground to rain and let His peace soak into the parched places of my soul." The young man leaned forward. "But how? How do you do that? How do you receive when everything in you is screaming with fear and uncertainty?" "You start by being still," Asher said. "You start by admitting that you cannot fix everything, cannot control everything, cannot guarantee anything. You start by acknowledging your complete dependence on God. And then you simply sit in His presence without agenda, without demands, without trying to make something happen. You just sit and you wait, and you let Him be God." He gestured to the spring again. "Watch the water. See how it flows? It does not hurry, does not strive, does not force its way. It simply flows where the rock allows it to flow. It trusts the underground source that feeds it, trusts the channel that guides it, trusts the purpose for which it was created. This is what you must learn. To trust like the water trusts, to flow like the water flows, to rest in the knowledge that you are sustained by a source that never fails." The woman had begun to weep quietly, tears streaming down her face. "But we have nothing," she whispered. "No home, no family support, no security for our child. How can we rest when we have nothing?" Asher reached out and took her hand gently. "My daughter, you have everything that matters. You have each other. You have the life growing within you. You have breath in your lungs and ground beneath your feet. And more than all of this, you have God, who sees you, who knows your situation, who has already made provision for your needs, even though you cannot yet see it." He released her hand and sat back. "Listen to me carefully. I am an old man now, and I have learned some things through decades of living and learning to trust. The God who feeds the birds and clothes the wildflowers, the God who makes springs flow in the desert and rain fall on just and unjust alike. This God knows about your child. He knew about this child before it was conceived. He has already prepared the way. Your uncle in Hebron, perhaps he will welcome you, or perhaps God has something else in mind. The point is not to know the future, but to trust the one who holds the future. Your job is not to figure everything out, but to take the next step, and then the next, resting in God between each step. The young man spoke, his voice rough with emotion. Will you teach us? Will you show us how to do this resting you speak of? We have 3 days until we must continue our journey to Hebron. Can we learn in 3 days? Asher smiled, a deep smile that carried decades of peace. You can begin in 3 minutes. The learning never ends. I am still learning after all these years. But yes, you can begin. And in 3 days, you can establish a practice that will sustain you for the rest of your lives. And so he taught them. Each morning, he brought them to the spring before dawn, when the air was cool and the world quiet. He taught them to sit in silence, to release their anxious thoughts like birds released from a cage, to simply be present in God's presence. He taught them to notice their breathing, to feel the solid earth beneath them, to hear the constant flow of water as a reminder of God's constant provision. He taught them words from Psalm 62, speaking them slowly, letting each phrase sink deep. Truly, my soul finds rest in God. My salvation comes from Him. Truly, He is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will never be shaken. He taught them to repeat these words when fear rose up, to use them as an anchor when uncertainty threatened to overwhelm. During the heat of the day, while his sheep rested in the shade, Asher would sit with the couple and share stories of his own journey, of Benjamin and the young shepherd boy and the traveling rabbi, of all those who had come to the spring and found more than water. He shared how God had been faithful through seasons of difficulty, how provision had always come even when it seemed impossible, how trust had been rewarded again and again. The young woman, whose name was Deborah, asked many questions. She wanted to understand how to trust when circumstances seemed hopeless, how to rest when action seemed necessary, how to surrender when every instinct screamed for control. Asher answered each question patiently, drawing not from theology he had studied, but from life he had lived. Deborah, he said on the second afternoon, you are about to give birth. When your time comes, will you be able to control the process? Will you be able to make it happen through your own effort? She shook her head. No, the child will come in its own time, in its own way. And what is your role in this? Asher pressed gently. To cooperate with what is happening, to breathe, to push when it is time to push, to rest when it is time to rest, to trust my body and trust God to see me through. Exactly, Asher said, and this is how all of life works. When we learn to live from a place of rest, we cooperate with what God is doing. We take action when action is called for. But the action flows from peace rather than panic, from trust rather than fear. We rest in between actions, gathering strength from the eternal source. We surrender the outcome to God, who loves us and our child more than we can imagine. Miriam joined them often during these 3 days, bringing food she had prepared, sitting quietly with them at the spring, adding her own gentle wisdom to Asher's teachings. She and Deborah formed a bond, one woman who had learned to trust God through the grief of childlessness, another learning to trust Him through the uncertainty of pregnancy without security. On the evening of the second day, Miriam drew Deborah aside and spoke to her privately. Asher did not hear their conversation, but he saw Deborah's tears, saw Miriam's gentle embrace, saw the younger woman's face transform from worry to wonder. Later, Miriam would tell him that she had shared the story of Hannah, who had wept in the temple and been given a son, and had spoken of how God sees every mother, every child, every family struggling to find their way. The third morning arrived, and Asher brought the couple to the spring one final time. The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky with delicate shades of rose and gold. The air was sweet with the scent of wild herbs, and somewhere a dove called, its voice pure and haunting. In the stillness, they sat in silence for a long time, the three of them simply being present. Asher noticed how the couple had changed in just these 3 days. The tightness around their eyes had eased. The desperate clutching quality of their fear had transformed into something quieter, more grounded. They sat with dignity now, with peace, with a kind of courage that came not from bravado, but from trust. Finally, as the sun crested the hills and poured golden light across the wilderness, Asher spoke. "You must continue your journey today. Your uncle awaits, whether he knows it yet or not. But before you go, I want you to understand something." He gestured to the spring, now brilliant in the morning light. "You will not always be able to come to this physical place. Life will take you far from here. But the truth this place represents, that is yours forever. Wherever you go, whatever circumstances you face, you can return to this practice of resting in God. You can remember that your soul finds rest in Him alone, that He is your rock and salvation." He reached into the folds of his cloak and pulled out 2 smooth stones he had taken from beside the spring. "Take these," he said, placing one in each of their hands. "When you hold them, remember this place. Remember what you learned here. Remember that God provides, God sustains, God holds you in His hands." Deborah clutched her stone tightly, fresh tears flowing. "We have no way to repay you for what you have given us." "There is no debt," Asher said firmly. "What I have given you was given to me freely, and I give it to you freely. But if you wish to honor what you have received, then do this. Teach your child what you have learned. And when you meet others who are weary and afraid, as you surely will, share with them the gift of rest. This is how the spring's waters spread, not through grand gestures, but through simple sharing, one person to another." The young man, whose name was Eli, stood and helped his wife to her feet. "We will do as you say, and we will name our child in honor of what we have learned here. If it is a boy, we will name him Malachi, my messenger, because he will carry the message of rest and trust. If it is a girl, Shiloh, peaceful one, for the peace we have found." Asher blessed them then, placing his weathered hands on their heads and speaking words of blessing that came from deep within, words that were part prayer and part prophecy. He blessed their journey, their arrival, their child, their future. He blessed the work of their hands and the fruit of their love. He blessed them in the name of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who sees, who provides, who never abandons His children. As they prepared to depart, Miriam pressed a small bundle into Deborah's hands. "Food for the journey," she said simply, "and a blanket for the baby when the time comes. I made it with my own hands, and I have prayed over every stitch." The couple departed as the morning was still young, walking southward toward Hebron and whatever awaited them there. Asher and Miriam stood watching until they disappeared from view, 2 small figures growing smaller in the vast landscape, held by something far greater than themselves. "Do you think they will be all right?" Miriam asked softly. I think they will face difficulties, Asher replied. Life is not easy, and being young and vulnerable makes it harder still. But they have learned something that will sustain them through whatever comes. They have learned where to find rest. That is enough. The seasons continued their eternal dance. Autumn arrived with its cooler air and migrating birds. Asher turned 67, and though his body continued its gradual decline, his spirit remained strong and clear. He had begun to delegate more of the shepherding to Daniel, who had grown into the role beautifully, becoming not just a skilled shepherd, but a teacher in his own right, continuing to guide others to the spring and share the practice of rest. One day, in mid-autumn, as leaves from the few scraggly trees near Tekoa began to turn bronze and gold, a messenger arrived from Hebron. He sought Asher specifically, and when they met, he delivered his news with evident pleasure. A young couple in Hebron, Eli and Deborah, asked me to find you and bring word. Their child was born 3 weeks ago, a healthy boy. They named him Malachi as they promised. Mother and child are well, and Deborah's uncle has welcomed them into his household. They wanted you to know that they practice what you taught them every day, and that they have already begun teaching others in Hebron about the spring and the rest it represents. Asher received this news with quiet joy, thanking the messenger and sending back his blessings. After the man departed, Asher sat for a long time in contemplation, marveling at how God worked. That young couple, who had arrived so desperate and afraid, were now established, secure, and already passing on what they had received. The waters of the spring were spreading just as they should, just as they were meant to. That evening, he shared the news with the village assembly, and there was collective celebration. Many in Tekoa remembered the young couple from their brief stay, remembered their fear and their need. To hear that they had found refuge, that their child had been born safely, that they were thriving, it confirmed what they all believed about God's faithfulness. Old Rebecca, a widow who had been visiting the spring for years, spoke up from her place at the back of the gathering. "This is what the prophet Isaiah spoke of," she said, her voice wavering but clear. "The Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land and will strengthen your frame. You will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail." She looked directly at Asher. "You have become that spring, my friend, not the water itself, but a channel through which God's living water flows to refresh the weary." Asher felt humbled by her words, but he knew they carried truth. He had become, through no merit of his own, a conduit for something greater than himself. The spring had changed him, and through him it was changing others, and through them it would change still others, rippling outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Winter came with unusual force that year, bringing heavy rains that turned the waters into roaring torrents, and the wilderness into a temporary sea of mud. The spring swelled with the increased water, becoming a rushing stream that carved a deeper channel through the rock. Asher, watching this transformation during a break in the storms, saw in it a message. Even the spring was not static, but growing, adapting, becoming more of what it was meant to be. The harsh weather made travel difficult, and for several weeks, few visitors came to the spring. Asher used this time for deeper rest, for reflection, for integrating all that he had learned over the years. He spent long hours in quiet contemplation, reviewing his life like a shepherd reviews his flock at day's end, taking inventory, giving thanks, acknowledging both failures and successes with equal grace. He thought about his father Joachim, who had first taught him to pray and wished he could tell the old man how those early lessons had borne fruit. He thought about the years of striving and fear before he found the spring, and felt compassion for that younger self who had carried so much weight so unnecessarily. He thought about all the people who had passed through his life, Benjamin and Daniel, Deborah and Eli, the Greek philosopher Theodore, the young shepherd boy, the traveling rabbi, each one a sacred encounter, each one part of the great tapestry God was weaving. One evening, as he sat with Miriam by their small fire, watching sparks rise into the darkness, he spoke of these reflections. "I have been thinking about legacy," he said, "about what remains when we are gone. I have no children to carry my name, no great achievements that will be recorded in scrolls, no wealth to leave behind, and yet I think perhaps I am leaving something more valuable." Miriam took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "You are leaving peace," she said simply. "You are leaving a practice, a pathway, a way of being in the world that will outlive you by generations. Children not yet born will be taught to rest in God because you learned to rest in God. That is legacy enough." The rains eventually ceased, and spring arrived with its usual explosion of life and color. The wilderness transformed overnight, it seemed, from browns and grays to vibrant greens and brilliant wildflowers. Asher, now approaching his 68th year, felt the renewal of the land echoed in his own spirit. Despite the limitations of his aging body, something in him was growing stronger, clearer, more at peace. One warm afternoon in late spring, as he sat at the spring with Daniel and a handful of others who had come seeking rest, a remarkable thing occurred. A stranger approached, a man of perhaps 40, well-dressed but travel-worn, his face marked by both grief and determination. He introduced himself as Matthias, a merchant from Damascus who had traveled many days specifically to find Asher and the spring. "My brother died 6 months ago," Matthias explained, his voice carefully controlled. "He was my closest friend, my business partner, my confidant. His death has shattered me in ways I cannot explain. I cannot sleep, cannot find peace, cannot see any meaning in continuing. Someone in Jerusalem told me about a shepherd in Tekoa who had found a spring where broken souls could be mended. I came because I have nowhere else to turn." Asher looked at this man with deep compassion, seeing in him the raw wound of recent grief, the desperate search for relief from unbearable pain. "Come," he said gently, "sit beside the water, and know that you are welcome here, in your grief, in your pain, in your brokenness. This is a place for the wounded, and there is no shame in acknowledging your wounds." Over the following days, Asher walked with Matthias through the territory of grief. He did not offer platitudes or false comfort, did not try to explain away the pain or rush the process of healing. Instead, he simply accompanied the man in his sorrow, creating space for tears, for rage, for the raw expression of loss. "Your brother's death is real," Asher said on the second day, as they sat together watching the sun set over the wilderness. "The loss is real. The hole in your life where he used to be is real. God does not ask you to pretend otherwise or to get over it quickly. He asks only that you bring your grief to him, that you let him sit with you in the darkness." "But how do I continue?" Matthias asked, his voice breaking. "How do I go on when half of who I am has been ripped away?" "You continue by not continuing alone," Asher replied. "You continue by learning that your identity does not rest solely in your relationships, precious as they are, but in God Himself. You continue by discovering that even in the valley of death's shadow, you are not abandoned. You continue by taking one breath and then another, trusting that God will give you what you need for each moment. He taught Matthias the practice of rest, adapted for grief. "Sit here," he instructed. "Listen to the water. It keeps flowing even after everything. It does not stop because of loss. It flows because that is its nature, because it is connected to a source deep underground that never fails. You're like this water, Matthias. You're connected to a source that will keep you flowing, keep you living, even when you feel you have no strength of your own." The merchant wept then, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from the core of his being. Asher let him weep, knowing that tears were not weakness, but release, not defeat, but the beginning of healing. When the storm of weeping finally subsided, Matthias looked at Asher with something like wonder in his eyes. "I have not wept like that since the funeral," he said quietly. "I have been holding it all in, trying to be strong, trying to keep functioning. But here, beside this water, with you sitting calmly nearby, I felt safe enough to let go." "That is the beginning," Asher said. "That is where healing starts, in the letting go, in the acknowledgement that we cannot carry everything ourselves, in the willingness to be vulnerable before God and trusted others." Matthias stayed for 2 weeks, longer than he had planned, longer than his business could easily spare him. But he knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that this was where he needed to be. Each day he practiced sitting in God's presence. Each day he let more of his grief pour out. Each day he felt the heavy stone of sorrow become slightly lighter, slightly more bearable. Asher introduced him to others in the village who had experienced loss, widows, parents who had buried children, elderly people who had watched entire generations pass. Each shared their story, and in the sharing, Matthias began to understand that grief was not something to overcome, but something to integrate, not an enemy to defeat, but a companion to acknowledge. On his final evening in Tekoa, Matthias sat with Asher as the sun painted the sky in magnificent colors. "I am not healed," he said honestly. "I still miss my brother terribly. I still feel the pain of his absence. But something has changed. I feel held, as if there are arms beneath me that will not let me fall completely. As if the grief, as terrible as it is not the whole story." "No," Asher agreed, "it is not the whole story. The whole story includes the grief, yes, but also includes God's faithfulness, the love of your brother that shaped you, the future that still awaits you, the purpose you have not yet discovered. Grief is a chapter, Matthias, but it is not the conclusion." Before departing, Matthias made a generous donation to the village, asking that it be used to help maintain the spring and support those who came seeking rest. "I came here broken," he told the village elders. "I leave still carrying my grief, but no longer crushed by it. This place, this practice, this man who taught me to rest in God even in sorrow, these have saved my life. Whatever I can give is small payment for so great a gift." As Asher watched another traveler depart, another life touched and changed by the simple practice of resting in God, he felt a deep sense of completion. He was 68 years old now, had lived a full life, had learned profound truths through difficult experience, and had been privileged to share those truths with countless souls. What more could any person ask? That night, lying beside Miriam, in the familiar darkness of their small home, listening to the sounds of the village settling into sleep, Asher felt a peace so profound it was almost tangible, like a physical presence filling the room. He realized that he was no longer afraid of anything, not aging, not weakness, not loss, not even death itself. He had learned too deeply, too thoroughly, that he was held by something unshakable. "I am ready," he whispered into the darkness. "Ready for what?" Miriam asked sleepily. "For whatever comes next," Asher replied. "For continuing this life as long as God grants it, or for passing into whatever lies beyond. I am at peace either way, because I know now with absolute certainty that my soul finds rest in God alone. Whatever comes, I am safe in Him." Miriam found his hand in the darkness and squeezed it gently. "I know," she said. "I have watched you learn this over all these years, and in watching you, I have learned it too. We are both safe, beloved, safe in the only way that truly matters." They lay in comfortable silence, two old souls at perfect peace, two lives intertwined and held by the eternal. Somewhere outside, a night bird sang. Somewhere in the distance, sheep stirred in their pens, and somewhere deep in the earth, water continued its patient work, flowing from hidden sources, sustaining life, never failing. Summer arrived with its characteristic intensity, bringing heat that shimmered off the limestone hills and made the very air seem liquid. Asher, now quite elderly and moving slowly, still made his daily pilgrimage to the spring, though Daniel often accompanied him now, ready to offer support, if needed. The flock was largely Daniel's responsibility, but Asher still went to be with the sheep, still sat in his favorite spots, still practiced the daily rhythm of rest that had become as natural as breathing. One morning in late summer, as Asher sat beside the spring with his eyes closed, simply being present in God's presence, he heard footsteps approaching. Opening his eyes, he was astonished to see a face he had not seen in decades. The old man who had appeared beside the spring all those years ago, the one who had carved the words into stone, the one who had taught him about rest. Except the old man looked exactly the same, ancient, weathered, yet somehow timeless, as if age had stopped applying to him at some point. He sat down beside Asher with a smile. "Hello, my friend," the old man said. "It has been many years." "It has," Asher agreed, too surprised to question how this could be. "I have thought of you often, wondered if you were real or a vision." The old man chuckled. "Does it matter? The teaching was real. The transformation was real. Everything that followed was real. Whether I am a flesh or spirit or something in between, does it change what you learned?" "No," Asher admitted. "It does not." "Good," the old man said. "Then let us simply enjoy this moment together. Two old shepherds sitting beside water that flows from the rock eternal." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then the old man spoke again. "You have done well, Asher, better than you know. The waters you discovered have spread far beyond this place. There are communities throughout Judea and Galilee, even beyond, where people practice what you learned here. They may not know your name, but they know the practice. They know how to rest in God." Asher felt tears gathering in his eyes. "I did nothing special. I was simply desperate enough to receive what was offered." "That is all God requires," the old man said gently. "Desperation is often the doorway to grace. Pride blocks the flow, but desperation opens the channel. You were broken enough to receive, and once you received, you were generous enough to give. That is the pattern, always. Receive and give. Receive and give, like the spring itself." He gestured to the water, which had grown significantly since Asher first discovered it. "Look how it has grown. Not through your effort, but through God's faithfulness. You simply kept returning, kept practicing, kept inviting others. The rest was God's work." "Who are you?" Asher asked suddenly. "Really? Are you an angel, a prophet, or simply a very old shepherd who understands these things?" The old man smiled mysteriously. "I am a messenger, sent to those who need to hear the message. Some see me, some do not. Some remember me, some forget, but the message remains. Your soul can find rest in God alone. He is your rock, your salvation, your fortress. This truth never changes, never fails, never disappoints. He stood slowly, preparing to leave. Your work here is nearly complete, Asher. Soon you will rest in a different way, a final way. But do not fear it. Death is just another step in the journey of trust. You have learned to rest in God through life. You will find it even easier to rest in Him through death. Will I see you again? Asher asked. Perhaps, the old man said. Or perhaps our next meeting will be on the other side, where all things are made clear and all rest is perfect and complete. Either way, we will meet again. Of that you can be certain. And then he was gone, walking up the slope with the same steady gait Asher remembered from decades before, neither hurrying nor lingering, simply moving with purpose toward some destination only he knew. Asher sat for a long time after the old man departed, pondering the encounter, feeling a mixture of wonder and peace. Daniel arrived mid-morning to check on him, and Asher shared what had happened. "Do you think he was really there?" Daniel asked, a mixture of curiosity and doubt in his voice. "I think," Asher said slowly, "that it does not matter. Whether he was physically present or a vision or something beyond my understanding, the message was real, and the message is what matters." The days continued to pass, each one a gift, each one an opportunity to practice rest, to share wisdom, to simply be present in God's presence. Asher's body continued its gradual decline. His sight grew dimmer, his hearing less sharp, his steps more uncertain, but his spirit remained clear and strong, anchored in the deep truth he had learned beside the spring. One evening, in early autumn, as the air began to carry hints of the coming coolness, Asher gathered the village for what he somehow knew would be his final teaching at the spring. People came from throughout Tekoa and beyond, elderly friends, young families, Daniel and his apprentices, travelers who happened to be passing through. They settled themselves on the rocks and grass around the spring as the sun began its descent toward the western hills. Asher stood, supported by his staff, looking out at the gathered faces. "My friends," he began, his voice still strong despite his age, "I want to tell you one last time about this journey I have traveled, not because you have not heard it before, but because these truths bear repeating, must be repeated, for they are easily forgotten in the noise and hurry of life." He paused, gathering his thoughts. 40 years ago, I was a shepherd like many of you, carrying responsibilities that felt too heavy, facing fears that seemed too great. I had always thought that strength meant never showing weakness, that faith meant never admitting doubt, that maturity meant handling everything on my own. And under the weight of these false beliefs, I was slowly being crushed. Then I found this spring, this small trickle of water in the wilderness, and beside it, words carved in stone, "The Lord is my rock and my salvation." And in that simple phrase, in that small gift of water, I began to learn what I had somehow never understood in all my years of religious observance and dutiful prayer. He looked around at the faces watching him, some young and eager, some old and knowing, all attentive. I learned that my soul could find rest in God alone, not in God plus my own efforts, not in God plus my own wisdom, not in God plus anything else, but in God alone, completely, entirely, without reservation or backup plans. This was terrifying at first, this absolute dependence. Everything in me wanted to keep one hand on my own solutions, my own strengths, my own resources. But gradually, through daily practice of returning to this place, of sitting in silence, of learning to receive rather than achieve, I discovered something miraculous. I discovered that when I truly rested in God, when I truly laid down my burdens and trusted Him completely, I received back strength I had never known. Not my strength, but His strength flowing through me. Not my wisdom, but His wisdom guiding my decisions. Not my peace manufactured through effort, but His peace given freely, abundantly, without measure. He gestured to the spring, now flowing strongly in the evening light. This spring has become a symbol, a living parable of what I learned. It flows constantly, never struggling, never striving, never anxious about whether it will have enough water for tomorrow. It simply flows from its source, and in flowing, it gives life to everything around it. This is what God calls us to be, channels of His life, His love, His peace. Not generators producing these things through our own effort, but channels receiving and passing on what flows from Him. The spring does not create the water. It simply allows the water to flow through it. We do not create peace or strength or wisdom. We simply allow them to flow through us from the one who is their source. This is the great paradox of faith, that in releasing control we gain true strength, that in admitting our weakness we find power, that in resting we become most productive, that in silence we hear most clearly, that in surrender we find victory. The gathered community sat in rapt attention, some with tears streaming down weathered faces, others nodding with recognition, children sitting unusually still as if sensing the weight of the moment. I know some of you carry heavy burdens tonight, Asher continued, his voice growing even softer, more intimate. Some of you are afraid of the future. Some grieve the past. Some struggle with illness, with poverty, with relationships that have fractured. Some simply feel the weight of being human in a world that often seems indifferent to our pain. He paused, letting his gaze move slowly across the gathering. To each of you, I say this: your soul can find rest in God alone, not in solving all your problems, though some will be solved, not in removing all difficulties, though some will be removed, but in knowing with absolute certainty that you are held by one who never lets go, supported by a foundation that never crumbles, sustained by love that never fails. Come to the spring when you can. Sit beside the water, but know that the spring is wherever you choose to stop and rest in God's presence. It can be in your home, in your field, in your market stall, in the quiet of early morning, or the darkness of night. The place matters less than the practice. The geography matters less than the posture of your soul. He raised his hands in blessing, his voice taking on the cadence of ancient prayer. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May His face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May He turn His face toward you and give you peace. And may you learn, as I have learned, that truly your soul can find rest in God alone. The gathering remained silent for a long moment after he finished, the words settling over them like dew on morning grass. Then, slowly, people began to rise, some coming forward to embrace Asher, others remaining seated in contemplation, still others making their way to the spring to touch the water, to read the carved words, to begin their own practice of rest. Daniel stood beside his teacher, his young face serious with understanding. That was beautiful, Master, but also it felt like a farewell. Asher smiled, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. Perhaps it was, or perhaps it was simply the culmination of a very long lesson, taught by a very slow student to others who might learn faster. Either way, the teaching will continue. Through you, Daniel, through all who have learned to rest. The spring will keep flowing long after this old shepherd is gone. That night, as Asher lay beside Miriam for what would be the last time, though neither of them knew it, they spoke of simple things, the stars visible through their small window, the sound of sheep settling for the night, the coolness of the evening air. They held hands like young lovers, though their hands were gnarled with age and marked by decades of labor. "It has been a good life," Asher said softly. "It has," Miriam agreed, "especially the second half, after you found the spring. After you found peace. After God found me," Asher corrected gently. "I was never looking for him adequately. He was always seeking me, waiting patiently for me to stop running long enough to be found." They drifted into sleep together, their breathing synchronizing as it had for decades, two souls at perfect rest. Asher dreamed that night. He dreamed he was walking beside the spring, but the spring had become a great river, flowing with crystal clarity. He was young again in the dream, strong and vigorous, but carrying all the wisdom of his years, and walking beside him was the old man who had first taught him about rest, except now the old man looked somehow familiar in a way Asher couldn't quite place. "Come," the old man said, his voice warm with welcome. "There is more to see, more to learn, more to experience. The spring was only the beginning. Now comes the ocean." And in the dream, Asher saw before him an endless expanse of water shimmering with light that seemed to come from within rather than without. The sight filled him with wonder and joy so intense it was almost unbearable. "Is this?" he began to ask. "Yes," the old man replied. "This is the source. This is where all springs flow from. This is perfect rest, eternal peace, complete knowing, and being known. This is home." Asher woke in the deep hours of the night, or perhaps he didn't wake at all. Miriam, sleeping beside him, sensed rather than saw the change. His breathing had shifted, become lighter, more peaceful. She opened her eyes in the darkness and knew, with the knowing that comes to those who have loved deeply and long, that her husband was passing from one shore to another. "Go in peace, my beloved," she whispered, her hand still holding his. "Rest now in the arms that have always held you. I will follow when my time comes." And Asher, if he heard her words, could not respond. But a small smile touched his lips, and his final breath was not a gasp or a struggle, but a gentle release, like a sigh of contentment at journey's end. The village woke to the news at dawn. Daniel found them when he came to collect Asher for the morning journey to the spring. The old shepherd and his wife, Asher having passed in the night, Miriam keeping vigil beside him, her hand still intertwined with his. The grief was real and deep, but it was not the grief of those without hope. They buried Asher on the hillside near the spring, as they had buried Benjamin before him. The entire village came, and travelers from distant places who had heard of the passing. They carved his name beside Benjamin's, and below it the words he had lived by. "My soul finds rest in God alone." Daniel, standing beside the grave as the sun set on the day of burial, spoke the words his teacher would have wanted spoken. He taught us that strength comes not from striving, but from resting. That peace is not the absence of trouble, but the presence of God in the midst of trouble. That our souls can find rest in God alone, and that this rest is sufficient for all things. In the days that followed, the spring continued to flow as springs do, indifferent to human grief, faithful to its nature. Daniel took up the mantle of shepherd and teacher, not trying to replace Asher, but to continue what he had begun. Others came seeking rest and found it. The practice spread further, carried by travelers and pilgrims to distant lands. Miriam lived another 5 years, spending her days in quiet contemplation, often sitting beside the spring, sometimes speaking to Asher as if he were still present, and perhaps, in the ways that matter most, he was. She taught the younger women of the village about rest, about trust, about the long journey of learning to surrender. When her own time came, she went peacefully, welcomed by those who had gone before. Years became decades. The spring continued to grow, becoming eventually a significant stream that sustained a much larger community. The village of Tekoa became known as a place of spiritual refuge, a destination for those seeking peace. The practice of resting in God spread throughout Judea and beyond, carried by those who had drunk from the spring and found more than water. Daniel grew old in his turn, teaching a new generation, who would teach another generation, who would teach another. The names changed, the faces changed, but the practice remained. The simple, profound discipline of resting in God alone. And always the spring flowed, through seasons of plenty and seasons of drought, through times of peace and times of war, through the rise and fall of kingdoms, through all the changes that mark human history. The spring remained constant, a living parable of God's faithfulness, an invitation to rest that never expired. Centuries later, travelers still come. They read the worn words carved in stone, "The Lord is my rock and my salvation," and wonder about the hand that carved them, the lives they touched, the legacy they left. They drink from water that flows from the same source that sustained Asher and Miriam, Benjamin and Daniel, Deborah and Eli, and countless others whose names are forgotten, but whose transformation was real. And sometimes, in the quiet of early morning or the stillness of evening, if they sit long enough beside the water, if they open themselves to receive rather than achieve, if they surrender their striving and simply rest, they find what Asher found. Not a technique or a formula, but a presence. Not a concept to grasp, but a reality to rest in. Not a distant God to understand, but a near God to know and be known by. They find that their souls, restless and weary and afraid, can indeed find rest in God alone, that He is their rock, their salvation, their fortress, that they will never be shaken, not because they are strong, but because their foundation is unshakable. They find, as Asher found, as countless others have found before and after, that this rest is not the end of the journey, but its beginning. Not the cessation of life, but its fullest expression. Not escape from the world, but engagement with it, from a place of peace rather than panic, from security rather than fear, from abundance rather than scarcity. And the spring continues to flow as it has for countless years, as it will for countless more. A gift given freely, sustained by a source that never fails, inviting all who are thirsty to come and drink and find rest for their souls. The story ends as it began, with water flowing from stone, with worn words carved by faithful hands, with the eternal invitation to rest. The characters may change, but the truth remains. In God alone, our souls find rest. He is our rock and our salvation. We will never be shaken. And as the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky above the spring, as the night birds begin their songs, as the world settles into the peace of evening, we too are invited to rest, to release the day's burdens, to surrender our striving, to trust in the one who holds us. May you, dear listener, find that same rest tonight. May your soul discover the peace that Asher discovered, the truth that transforms, the love that never fails. May you know as you drift into sleep that you are held by hands that will never let you go, supported by a foundation that will never crumble, loved by a love that will never end. Rest now. Rest in the knowledge that you are safe. Rest in the promise that you are valued. Rest in the certainty that you are held. Let the waters of peace wash over you. Let the stillness settle into your bones. Let the eternal presence that sustained Asher sustain you now. Your soul finds rest in God alone, and in that rest, may you find the sleep your body needs and the peace your spirit craves. Shalom. Peace be with you, now and always. If you found peace in this journey through ancient lands and timeless truths, I invite you to continue exploring more stories that bring rest and renewal. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us. May you sleep deeply, dream peacefully, and wake refreshed in the morning light.